In August of 1900, a British general sent a telegram to London declaring that 500 Australian soldiers were finished. He had not spoken to a single one of them. He had not fired a shot in their defense. He had simply looked at the smoke rising over the South African veld, decided the arithmetic was too ugly, and ridden away. The Empire filed a telegram. The newspapers prepared their black-bordered columns. And the official record moved on because 500 colonial volunteers trapped on a bare rock under 3,000 enemy guns were clearly a closed account. 11 days later, when a British cavalry column finally rode in expecting to find graves, they found something that made every officer in the column stop talking. The Australians were standing, armed, unbroken, and absolutely livid about the service. This is the siege of Eland's River, the battle that Britain tried to forget, the Boers never could forget, and Australia should have tattooed across its national consciousness in letters a meter high. The Anglo-Boer War had been grinding through South Africa for nearly a year by the time August 1900 rolled around, and every comfortable assumption the British Empire held about easy colonial victories had already been kicked to pieces by Boer commandos who refused to read the script. The Grand Imperial Army, with its polished buttons and parade ground discipline, had been humiliated at Colenso, mauled at Spion Kop, and besieged at Ladysmith and Mafeking. The Boers, Dutch-descended farmers and cattlemen, who knew every fold of the landscape, fought with a guerrilla brilliance that left British staff officers staring at their maps in genuine confusion. London had responded by flooding the country with reinforcements drawn from every colony that owed the Crown a favor. And among those reinforcements were thousands of Australians who had volunteered for a war on the other side of the planet for reasons that ranged from patriotic duty to the simple desire to see if they could handle a real fight after a lifetime of handling everything the Australian outback could throw at them. Men who ended up at Eland's River were drawn from this exact breed: bushmen, riders, shearers, drovers, fencers, prospectors. Miners from the dry guts of the continent. Men whose hands were scarred before they were 20, whose idea of a comfortable night involved a saddle for a pillow and a sky full of stars that could freeze your breath by midnight. The British Army looked at them and saw shambles, slouched hats, unbuttoned tunics, an allergy to saluting, and a vocabulary that could strip paint off a warship at 50 paces. What the British Army failed to notice was that these men could ride harder, shoot straighter, and endure more physical punishment than any Guards regiment that ever marched through Whitehall. And that blindness was about to cost the Empire something far more valuable than a supply depot. The depot at Brackfontein Drift on the Eland's River sat in the western Transvaal like a target with a sign on it, a British transit storage point for ammunition, rations, and equipment. It occupied flat, exposed ground near the river, with minimal natural fortification and a defensive perimeter that any competent tactician would have described as hopeless. Roughly 500 Australians held the position, tasked with guarding supplies that the wider British campaign needed, but apparently did not value highly enough to protect with serious numbers. The nearest major British force was days of hard riding away. If anything went wrong, the garrison was on its own, and everyone from the commanding general down to the newest bugle boy knew it. What nobody in British command bothered to calculate was what might happen if something went very wrong indeed, because the assumption was always that Australians could be replaced more easily than the supplies they were guarding. On the morning of August 4th, the veld around Eland's River erupted. General Kuzlare, one of the most feared and respected Boer commanders of the entire war, a man whose name alone was enough to make British columns change their route, had assembled a force of between 2,500 and 3,000 fighters in a ring around the depot. These were seasoned commandos, expert marksmen mounted on fast ponies, supported by modern Krupp-field guns manufactured in Germany and Maxim Nordenfeldt machine guns that could chew through timber and flesh with industrial efficiency. The odds were roughly 6-1 in manpower, with an overwhelming advantage in artillery that the Australians had absolutely no means of matching. On paper, the engagement was over before it started. De Laret had the numbers, the guns, the position, and the element of surprise, and the men inside that depot had bolt-action rifles, a few entrenching tools, and each other. The first shells came screaming in before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, and the depot transformed into a scene that survivors would struggle to describe for the rest of their lives. Krupp rounds detonated among the supply wagons, sending splinters and shrapnel slicing through the air. Draft animals, horses, mules, oxen went down screaming. Ammunition crates burst apart, tents shredded, and the flat, exposed ground that had looked merely unfortunate on a map revealed its true horror in 3 dimensions. Because there was nowhere to hide on a surface that offered all the cover of a billiard table. Any garrison of regular infantry trained in the European tradition would have been looking at a white flag within hours. The mathematics of the situation demanded it. Surrounded, outgunned, with no relief in sight and shells falling like rain. The rational military response was honorable capitulation followed by prisoner of war status and eventual release. This was how wars between civilized nations were supposed to work, and every textbook on the subject agreed. The textbooks had never met Australian miners. Within the first hours of the bombardment, while Krupp shells were still tearing the surface apart, the bushmen grabbed picks, bayonets, shovels, rifle butts in their bare hands and began attacking the ground itself. The earth at Eland's River was hard, slaty shale, compacted sedimentary rock that professional engineers would normally approach with pneumatic drills and several days of planning. The Australians approached it with the same tool set they had used in the gold fields of Kalgoorlie, the copper mines of Broken Hill, and the water bores of outback Queensland. Brute force, practical knowledge, and a furious refusal to accept that the rock was harder than their willpower. Under shell fire, while shrapnel sang overhead, with the ground bucking and heaving from detonations close enough to shower them with debris, these men carved trenches into stone. They read the rock the way a farmer reads clouds before a storm. Instinctively, practically. Without needing a geological survey or an engineering degree, miners knew where the fracture lines ran and how deep you needed to go before the shale became your roof instead of your problem. Farmers knew how to pace physical labor across hours without burning out, how to keep swinging a tool when every muscle was screaming to stop. Together, they turned bare rock into a network of deep, interconnected trenches and overhead shelters that swallowed the energy of exploding shells the way sandbags never could. Within 48 hours, the exposed depot had become a stone fortress that no one in Boer command had anticipated and no one in British command would have believed possible. De la Rey watched his artillery pound the position day after day and saw something that troubled him deeply. The Australians were absorbing punishment that should have broken any garrison on Earth, and their return fire was actually getting more accurate. Every attempt to probe the perimeter met the same response. The bushmen, crouching in their rock-cut firing positions, delivered rifle volleys with a precision that made the Boers reconsider the entire concept of an infantry assault. These were men who had grown up shooting kangaroos at 400 yards from a moving horse, men who wasted ammunition the way they wasted words. Almost never. A Boer scouting party that showed itself for 3 seconds received a concentrated burst of infield fire that left no room for a second attempt. The perimeter was small. The defenders were few. But every yard of that trench line was held by someone who could hit what he aimed at. And the Boers learned this lesson the hard way at every point of the compass. Meanwhile, life inside the perimeter was deteriorating in ways that tested human endurance to its absolute boundaries. The hundreds of draft animals caught in the initial bombardment lay rotting in the August sun, and within days the stench became a physical force. A wall of putrefaction so thick that men gagged through rags tied across their faces and still could not escape it. Flies descended in clouds dense enough to darken the air. Daytime temperatures turned the stone trenches into ovens that baked the men from below while the sun scorched them from above. At night, the temperature plunged below freezing, and the same men who had been gasping from heat hours earlier now shivered uncontrollably in tattered uniforms with no blankets. Water became the currency of survival, and earning it required the most dangerous job in the entire siege. The Eland's River ran within reach of the camp, but reaching it meant crossing open ground that Boer sharpshooters had zeroed with meticulous care. During daylight, the approaches were a guaranteed end for anyone foolish enough to try. The only option was to go at night, flat on your belly, canteens clinking softly against the earth, crawling through darkness, so complete you navigated by memory and the faint sound of running water. Boer snipers knew the routes and waited with the patience of men who had hunted springbok since childhood. A silhouette against the moon, a canteen scraping a rock, even a sharp intake of breath could draw a Mauser round you would never hear before it found you. Men volunteered for these crawls every single night. There was no order, no roster, no system of compulsion. Blokes simply looked at the empty canteens, looked at their mates whose lips were cracking and whose tongues were swelling from dehydration, and started crawling. Some came back with water. Some came back with fresh bullet grazes across their shoulders and backs. And some made the trip night after night after night because the trenches needed water and someone had to fetch it, and the only qualification required was the willingness to go. This was mateship reduced to its most elemental chemical formula. You risked your neck because the bloke beside you was thirsty, and that was the entire calculation. And then into this furnace of endurance came the moment that defined the character of the Elands River garrison more than any feat of digging or marksmanship ever could. General de la Rey, watching the siege drag past its first week with the Australians still firing and still very much alive, made a decision that reflected both his tactical pragmatism and his genuine respect for a courageous enemy. He sent a messenger under a white flag carrying an offer of honorable surrender. The terms were generous by any standard: full military honors, lives spared, treatment as prisoners of war, eventual release. De la Rey was offering the Australians a door out of a situation that every objective measure said was unsurvivable, and he was doing it with a courtesy that acknowledged their extraordinary resistance. The Australians sent the messenger back with a single word that could not be misunderstood. They said no. No conditions, no counterproposals, no request for time to think, just a flat, blunt, unmistakable refusal that landed on de la Rey's desk like a slap. The white flag went back across the lines. The Krupp guns reopened, and the bushmen went back to their stone holes and resumed the business of staying alive and making the Boers pay for every meter of ground they tried to take. There is something in this refusal that resists easy explanation, because rational military logic says you accept those terms every single time. You are outnumbered 6-1. Your own side has abandoned you. You have no artillery, limited ammunition, barely enough water to keep your men conscious, and no realistic prospect of relief. A professional soldier trained in the calculus of acceptable losses would sign the surrender document and sleep well that night, knowing he had saved his men from pointless destruction. But these were Australian bushmen, and the calculus they used was borrowed from a different school entirely. In the outback, you did not quit a boundary fence because the sun was too hot and the wire was too heavy and the nearest water was a day behind you. You finished the fence because the sheep depended on it and the bloke working the next section was counting on you. You did not walk away from a flooded river crossing because the current looked bad, because the cattle were already in the water and your mate was already on the far bank waiting. You held on. You pushed through. You kept going until the job was done or your body physically could not continue. And even then, you found a way to do a little more before you stopped. This was the mentality that de la Rey's generous offer collided with, and it never stood a chance. The Boer general later told his fellow commanders that the Australians at Elands River were among the most formidable opponents he had ever faced. He did not mean their weapons or their numbers. He meant something deeper, a stubbornness rooted so firmly in their identity that no amount of artillery could dig it out. His shells could destroy wagons, scatter supplies, and crater the earth. But they could not touch the thing that actually held that garrison together because it was not made of stone or steel. It was made of the shared wordless understanding between 500 men that giving up was worse than anything the guns could do. 13 days. The bombardment lasted 13 relentless, grinding, merciless days. Approximately 2,500 shells hammered a perimeter so small that every single round landed within lethal range of the trenches. The camp became a moonscape of craters, wreckage, and decomposing animals. The men inside it existed on starvation rations, contaminated water, and sheer defiance. Sleep was measured in minutes between shell impacts. Medical care was whatever a mate with a torn shirt and steady hands could improvise, and every dawn brought the same grim inventory. Count the ammunition, count the water, count the men still able to hold a rifle and decide whether today was the day the numbers finally ran out. Every dawn the numbers held, barely, impossibly, infuriatingly for the Boers, but they held. On the far side of the equation, the British Empire had moved on with the serene confidence of an institution that assumed its own paperwork was always correct. General Carrington's telegram had been accepted, filed, and forgotten. The Elands River garrison existed only as a line item in a casualty estimate, a minor loss in a war that was producing major losses with depressing regularity. Lord Kitchener dispatched a large force into the western Transvaal region as part of a broader sweep operation. The purpose was to clear Boer resistance, secure supply lines, and perform the administrative task of locating and burying the remains of units that had been overwhelmed during the preceding weeks. The Elands River Depot was on the list. The expected task was grave registration. Nobody packed extra rations for survivors because there were not supposed to be any. On the 16th of August, the advanced riders of the relief column topped the last ridge before Elands River and pulled their horses to a halt. Below them, the landscape looked like the surface of another planet. A tortured expanse of craters, shattered wagons, bloated animal carcasses, and drifts of debris that stretched in every direction. The stench hit them from hundreds of meters away, strong enough to make hardened cavalrymen turn their heads. Every visual indicator screamed total destruction, complete annihilation. The kind of scene you rode through slowly while a chaplain said words and men with shovels followed behind. And then they saw the flag. It was still flying over the center of the camp, tattered and powder-blackened, but unmistakably raised and unmistakably deliberate. For a long moment, nobody in the relief column could process what they were looking at because it contradicted every piece of information they had been given and every assumption they had carried across the veld. Then the trenches began to move. Figures emerged from the stones slowly, stiffly, like something from a fever dream. They were caked in layers of red dust and black powder residue until their features were barely distinguishable as human. Their uniforms were rags. Their boots, where they still existed, were held together with wire and strips of canvas. Their eyes burned out of hollowed faces with the peculiar intensity of men who had been staring across a gun sight for nearly 2 weeks without adequate food, water, or rest. They were thin to the point of skeletal, sunburned beyond recognition, and moving with the cautious deliberation of people whose muscles had been locked in cramped positions for days on end. They were also very clearly, very defiantly, very thoroughly alive. Of the roughly 500 defenders, fewer than 20 had been lost during 13 days of continuous bombardment by heavy artillery. Fewer than 20 from 2,500 shells. The stone trenches that bushmen had carved from shale with mining picks and bayonets had performed better than any purpose-built military fortification in the South African theater. The goldfield knowledge of how rock fractures and absorbs energy, the farming knowledge of how to build structures that endure, and the universal Australian knowledge of how to make do with whatever the earth gives you had combined into something that professional military engineers would study with genuine astonishment for decades. The British cavalrymen sat on their horses and stared at the men emerging from the ground, and the men emerging from the ground stared back with expressions that mixed exhaustion, relief, and a cold, specific anger, directed not at the Boers, who had at least done them the courtesy of fighting honestly, but at the British system that had written them off without a backward glance. General Carrington's subsequent career trajectory tells its own story. The man who had turned his column around, who had sent the telegram that declared the garrison beyond saving, who had condemned 500 men to the paperwork equivalent of a mass grave while they were still very much alive and fighting, found himself quietly removed from positions of meaningful authority. His name did not appear in the honor rolls or the victory dispatches. It appeared instead in the margins, in the footnotes, in the kind of administrative silence that the British Army reserves for officers whose failures are too embarrassing to punish publicly, but too obvious to reward. He faded into retirement carrying the particular kind of disgrace that comes from having been proven wrong by the people you were supposed to protect. The Australians themselves went back to their lives with the minimum of ceremony that their culture demanded. There were no victory parades through Sydney or Melbourne, no keys to the city, no front-page profiles of individual heroes. The bushmen of Elands River had done what bushmen did. They handled what needed handling. They looked after each other, and they came home. Some went back to the goldfields. Some went back to their stations and their stock routes. Some carried shrapnel in their bodies for the rest of their lives and mentioned it roughly as often as they mentioned the weather which is to say only when it caused them direct inconvenience. The siege entered the Australian consciousness as something quieter than a legend but more durable than a headline. It became a reference point, a proof of concept, a piece of evidence that Australians would cite for the next century whenever someone in a fancy uniform from a powerful capital suggested that colonials could not be trusted to hold the line. Elands River proved that the skills of the outback, the ability to read rock, to endure extremes, to improvise under pressure, to keep working when the job was beyond brutal, translated directly into military capability of the highest order. A miner who could swing a pick for 12 hours underground could dig a trench in shale that stopped Krupp shells. A drover who could drive cattle across featureless desert could navigate a battlefield at night without a map. A shearer who could work in 100-degree heat from dawn to dark could endure conditions that would hospitalize soldiers from gentler climates. And above all, men who had grown up relying on each other because the nearest help was 100 miles away could hold a perimeter together without orders, without officers, without any external motivation beyond the simple, absolute, non-negotiable refusal to let the bloke beside them down. De la Rey understood this. He paid the Australians the highest compliment a warrior can offer another warrior. He remembered them in his dispatches and his conversations with fellow Boer leaders. The garrison at Elands River occupied a special category of respect, a recognition that these strange sun-blackened colonials from the far side of the world possessed something that could not be manufactured in any military academy or instilled by any amount of drill. They brought it with them from a landscape that forgave nothing and taught everything, and they applied it to a situation that the entire British command structure had dismissed as hopeless. The telegram that declared them finished was never formally withdrawn. The British Empire did not issue corrections of that nature, because issuing a correction would mean admitting that a general had abandoned colonial troops and that the colonials had succeeded without him. And both admissions were unacceptable to the institutional pride of an organization that believed deeply in the natural superiority of its own officer class. So the telegram sat in the files, technically uncorrected, permanently contradicted by the simple fact that the men it wrote off walked out of their trenches under their own power and went home. Somewhere in the hard shale beside the Elands River, the marks of picks and bayonets are still visible if you know where to look. Shallow grooves in stone that tell the story more honestly than any official dispatch ever did. 500 men stood on that rock, and the greatest empire in human history told them they were already gone. And they answered with the only argument that mattered. They were still there when the dust cleared. And every word of that telegram was wrong.